right? All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Milligan. I am the chair of the Oklahoma Archivist Association Education Committee. Welcome to part 3 of this 6-part virtual workshop series, Archiving 101, Fundamentals of Collection Management. This is a program of the Oklahoma Archivist Association, which is an organization to promote networking and education for archives professionals, students, and record keepers in the state of Oklahoma. The series is also sponsored by the Oklahoma Department of Libraries and the Oklahoma Historical Records Advisory Board with funding support from the National Historical Publications and Records Commission. So as I said before I started recording, we are going to be recording today's workshop so we can share it later on the Oklahoma Archivist Association website, and so you all can go back and revisit any information as well. You can see past recorded webinars on the website under the resources tab. So if you weren't able to attend session 1 or 2 of this series, but want to review that content, obviously you can go back and do that. I also wanted to just give a reminder that the Oklahoma Archivist Association Oklahoma Archives Bazaar is coming up. So check the organizational website for information on that. It's going to be pretty interesting to learn more about what your archives colleagues in the state are up to. And we are now firmly entrenched into Archives Month. So if this is your first acknowledgement that October is Archives Month, celebrate with us. So today is session 3, the preservation environment. So we will be talking about summary analysis, final order, preservation processing, environmental controls, supplies and storage solutions, security, and disaster planning. To give a glimpse into how you should be thinking about those things. This session will be led by Holly Hasenfratz. Holly is an archivist and I've been saying Oklahoma archivists. Holly is an archivist and records management specialist in the state archives at the Oklahoma Department of Libraries. She's been with the state archives for just over 3 years. She was previously the digital and institutional archivist at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum in Oklahoma City. Holly has been in archives for 9 years. She's a certified archivist and holds the Essentials of Records and Information Management certificate from ARMA International. She's passionate about archives research and loves connecting researchers to collections, which is why we're so excited to have you here presenting this topic to us today. So from this point on, I'm going to pass it over to Holly. I'll help manage the chat and filter questions. And you can put things in and we will have a period for questions and answers toward the end of Holly's presentation. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. Let me share my screen.
Three ring hole punches?
Yeah. We got the little black one in the back.
Yeah, we just bought another one. Yeah. Oh, yeah, right there.
All right. Can everyone see my screen? Yes. Okay, great. Thank you so much for that introduction. I really want to thank the Oklahoma Archivist Association for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today about a topic that I'm super excited about. I love all things preservation and disaster prep. So this is really fun for me. And I hope it'll be really fun for you guys today too. I also just want to do a quick thank you to the Oklahoma Department of Libraries, the Oklahoma Historical Records Advisory Board, and the National Historical Publications and Records Commission for helping to fund this series. So let's get into it. There we go. So I just want to do a quick recap of Jennifer's session from last week, bringing in new collections. She gave a great overview on legal ownership and what types of documentation that you should be collecting for your collections and your repositories, and why it's really important to retain and maintain that documentation. She also talked about physical and intellectual control, and just documenting the acquisitions in general and what you should be having, what to do if you have legacy collections where maybe you're missing some of that documentation, and great resource suggestions for working on creating some of that paperwork and documentation going forward. So today, like Sarah said, we're really talking about the preservation environment. We're going to be talking a little bit about preservation processing. So what you can do as you are processing your collections, as well as what happens if you encounter a disaster. And we'll talk a little bit too about disaster preparation. And I think that we'll have lots of time afterward for questions, but if you have questions in the meantime, you can feel free to type those in the chat. And if not, we can always talk about things afterwards too. So archival preservation, as archivists, records managers, collection managers, we want to preserve the materials in our collections in perpetuity. So, but we also need to provide access to them. Archival materials require preservation in order to keep them in the best condition possible for as long as possible. So the best ways that we can extend the life of these collections is to control the environment to the best of our abilities. We can utilize appropriate storage methods using archival quality folders and boxes. And we can make sure that we're following good handling practices. And it's also important for us to know what the risks are to our collections, how we can mitigate that risk, and identify what steps we need to take if a disaster occurs. So why do materials deteriorate? It's just part of the natural life process, basically. There are things that we can do to take control to kind of slow down these natural chemical processes that lead to deterioration. But there's just a lot of environmental factors, natural acids that occur in the materials themselves in our collections, whether it's the paper, the ink on the paper, maybe there are some chemicals involved. But there's human intervention, neglect, lots of other things that contribute to deterioration. The list that you're looking at right now, these are some of the agents that really help accelerate the deterioration process. So things like temperature fluctuation, humidity fluctuation, too much light exposure, biological agents, organic materials, housekeeping practices, and then of course, disasters, things that we can't control, but we can certainly prepare for. So most of our collections are probably largely paper-based. Paper that's created before the 1840s was made out of cotton and flax rags that was turned into pulp. This type of paper can last a very long time. Paper that was created after the 1840s, which is probably what is the majority of the paper in our collections. This is considered more modern paper. This type of paper production used trees as the source of pulp. So it's naturally very, very acidic. And it produces lots of acid when it's exposed to air and moisture. This type of paper turns brown and brittle over time. It becomes very, very crumbly. I know that we are all way too familiar with this type of paper, but it can show signs of deterioration as early as 10 years after production. So I think in a lot of our collections, we also have a lot of photographs. There's lots of different types of photographs that you might have in your collections, such as glass plate negatives, tintypes, daguerreotypes, slides, photo negatives, Polaroids, really runs the gamut of photographic innovations and technology. But photographs are made up of layers. No matter what type of photograph it is, it has layers. And each layer responds differently to the environment. Photographs are really finicky in a way that these layers are bound together. So they can absorb moisture, they can lose moisture, and any of these things can lead to deterioration. And if one layer of your photograph fails, you can lose the image. So these are just things to be aware of when you have photographs and paper in your collections. So preservation as a part of processing. These are just some general preservation tips that apply to all sizes of collections. Whether you're working with a very small collection or a very large collection, these are just some good practices to kind of get into the habit of when you are processing a collection. I've included some pictures here that you can see of metal is enemy number one. It rusts terribly. So you'll see, you can see rust damage from paper clips and staples in these documents. So as you're processing a collection, if it is safe to do so, I would always recommend that you remove metal fasteners, including staples and paper clips. You might have brads, you might see other types of metal in the collection. It will rust over time and it can significantly damage your document. So I would always recommend to remove those things if it is safe to do so, if you can safely remove it without causing damage to the document itself. You might have items that come into your collection in unsafe containers. So it's always a good idea to replace those items with containers that will help keep the collection safe and in good condition. Some types of plastics are extremely unstable and can even be flammable. So it's always a good idea to examine the condition of the materials and figure out what you can do right then and there to create a good preservation environment for the materials. In this step in the process, you would also want to look for rubber bands and remove any rubber bands. They dry out and become very brittle and crumbly. They can also become very sticky. And you'll want to watch out for dirt and debris and gently clean any of the materials if you see dirt and debris. And at this point, you should also check for evidence of pests. I know Jennifer touched on this, but it is not uncommon when you are processing a collection, if it has been stored in less than ideal conditions, for you to see droppings or insect carcasses, anything like that. So you'll want to be mindful of those things when you are going through your collection. Okay, so I want to talk about creating a microenvironment for the collection. So when we think about microenvironments, we're thinking about a contained environment to help protect the materials from light, from dirt, from moisture, from pest incursions. This is really the first line of defense for your archival collections. So we think about this as most of our collections, they, spend most of their lifetime in their collection boxes. So it's really important that we do the best that we can to provide a safe, stable environment to house our objects in. So when you're processing a collection, you always want to handle records as little as possible. If you're working with paper-based objects, clean, dry hands, that's great. If you are working with photographic material, you might want to wear cotton gloves. If you smudge an image, it's almost impossible to remove a thumbprint from a photographic negative. But in general, when you're working with paper-based collections, you can just make sure that your hands are clean and dry and free of lotions or hand sanitizers. And you'll want to make sure that you're using archival quality supplies to house your collections in. Archival supplies can be very, very expensive. So in general, you'll want to spend money on supplies that come into direct contact with the materials in your collection. So objects that would come into direct contact, that would be like an acid-free folder and an acid-free box to house the folder in. So I kind of want to talk about those terms briefly. Acid-free, lignin-free, and buffered. These are terms that you'll see a lot in archival products. And so what does that really mean? So acid-free, it refers to chemically purified paper products that have undergone essentially like a washing treatment where the acid has been removed. These types of paper products, they have a pH rating of 7, which is, if you remember back to like high school science, that's right in the middle between acidic and basic on the pH scale. Lignin-free, so paper products are made from wood pulp, which contains lignin. So as lignin deteriorates, it becomes very, very acidic. So lignin-free refers to paper products that have had the lignin removed through a chemical process. And then lastly, buffered really refers to paper products that have an alkaline buffering agent that has been added during production. It protects against migrating acids. So acid, when an object becomes acidic, that acid will travel to the other objects in the collection. So sometimes you might need to put a piece of buffering paper to kind of help slow down that process of acid migration. And then I listed here some archival suppliers: Gaylord, Hollinger, University Products. There are a lot of different archival retailers out there. Talus is a great source for equipment. So if you need bone folders or spatulas, any kind of specialized equipment, Talus, they have really great products for pretty good prices. So then part of your microenvironment also is, making sure that you are using these acid-free products, but then also using a number 2 pencil, using a white eraser, just to kind of make sure that you're not introducing harmful chemicals that could be in pens or Sharpies or things like that into the collection. I've also included down here at the bottom, this will take you to a link to the Northeast Document Conservation Center. They have a series of preservation leaflets that are really, really helpful. They have one specifically for storage and handling practices. And I think the slides will be available, sent out to you guys, so you'll be able to check some of these links out. Okay, so storing collections. Again, this is all part of the preservation environment. You want to try to control the physical environment as much as you can. So we're avoiding storing collections in basements or attics. Kind of a very, very general rule of thumb when you're storing archival collections is if you would be uncomfortable in a space, you don't want to store your materials in that space also. So we avoid basements because of high moisture content, and attics because of low moisture content. They also both have a ton of temperature fluctuation. And our whole goal really is to try to create a stable climate environment. You'll also want to make sure that the shelving that you're using to store your archival collections is secure and sturdy and can support the weight of the collections. And then you'll also want to make sure that they are stored in a secure location. And we'll talk about security a little bit later on. Box location. So this is just a picture I included of some of our boxes here in the state archives. Because we deal with government records, our volume of records is really, really high. So we use cubic foot boxes as opposed to the traditional 5-inch gray archival boxes. But you want to make sure that when you're storing a large collection or a large volume of records that you're not putting really, really heavy boxes really high up because that poses a safety risk, obviously, to you and your staff. You also want to avoid storing collections on the floor. You never know when you might have water or pest incursion. So it's always good to make sure that your materials are at least 4 to 6 inches off of the ground. And it's always a good idea to label your storage containers. We want to keep our collections in a dark space, essentially, to avoid, as much light exposure as possible. So if you have labels on your boxes, then you know what's in them, in theory, and that avoids you having to open or get into boxes unnecessarily. So temperature and relative humidity. Some of the problems that lead to deterioration of materials come from temperature and humidity. High temperatures will increase the speed of the chemical reactions that cause deterioration. High humidity just adds fuel to the fire. But temperature and humidity are interrelated, so one affects the other. If you don't have enough humidity, that can pull a lot of moisture out of your documents and cause them to become more brittle. So good climate control, just as a baseline, your temperature in your storage collections area should be no higher than 70 degrees. And you should try to maintain a relative humidity between 30 and 50%. Of course, the lower the temperature is better for your collections, but keep in mind that that will affect your relative humidity. So it's a good idea to invest in some kind of temperature and humidity gauge where you can monitor that. I just included a little picture. This is one that I found off of Amazon for 15 bucks, but they're relatively inexpensive. And it's a good idea to monitor, especially here in Oklahoma, our weather is all over the place. And so it's a really good idea to make sure that you're maintaining a good relative humidity and temperature. Again, a stable climate is really ideal when we're talking about collection storage. We don't want a lot of temperature or humidity fluctuations because that will increase potentially the deterioration process. So light, we also want to avoid lots of exposure to our collections. Light accelerates the deterioration of our materials. It weakens the paper fibers. It makes them very brittle. It will cause your paper to bleach yellow. It can cause it to darken. Same thing if you have a handwritten document, the ink can bleach out when it's exposed to too much light. With light, the damage is irreversible. So make sure that you're really cognizant of light density and duration of light exposure. So just some good things to keep in mind. It's good to avoid UV light whenever possible. If you have the ability, you can purchase UV filters to go over fluorescent bulbs. LED bulbs are the best. They cause minimal damage and they have a low energy output. So they're really efficient. You should never store your collections near windows. We just want to make sure that we're keeping our light levels very, very low. And of course, if a collection is not in use, the best practice is to make sure that you're putting it back in its box on the shelf, just to avoid any unnecessary light exposure. So cleaning and housekeeping, these are all things that yeah, we know that we should be doing this. But just, as a good refresher for all of us, we need to avoid food and drink in our collections areas. Not only do you run the risk of spilling something on your materials, but they also attract pests. So we need to make sure that we're also taking the trash out and cleaning regularly in our storage spaces or anywhere where we might be accessing or utilizing our archival collections. You'll want to avoid using harsh chemicals in the presence of collections. But of course, if you do need to clean something, just make sure that you're mindful of where your collections are. Let's see. I think I skipped one. Oh, no. Okay. I missed a slide. Okay. So now I kind of want to talk about disaster preparation. So there are kind of 4 tenets of disaster preparation: prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery. So prevention is really the cornerstone of emergency preparedness. Preparedness itself, those are the steps that you'll take to minimize the losses that may happen when a disaster occurs or if a disaster occurs. Response refers to the actions to save lives and prevent further damage. And recovery are the actions that you need to take in order to return to normal operations after a disaster occurs. This can be something as simple as when staff returns to the building. It could be something more severe as far as if a building needs to be undergo some construction. So risk assessment. Risks can't be avoided completely. And even if you are really, really well prepared, events can happen. But we can do a lot of things to help try to mitigate those risks. So what you'll want to do with your collections and your space, your repository in which you're storing and working with your collections, think about the things that could go wrong and look at what steps you could take to prevent things from going wrong. Then you'll want to come up with a plan for what you might do if something happens. Some of the major risks that we'll talk about are fire, flood, theft, and unauthorized access. It's helpful to have a checklist of things that you know that might be risky to your collections and to check on those things regularly. So let's talk about the two types of disasters. UNESCO classifies disasters into two categories, natural and man-made. So for us, it's really important to think about regional threats when we're thinking about natural disasters. Knock on wood, we don't really have to worry about blizzards or hurricanes, but of course we do have to worry about tornadoes, flooding, ice, and snow. And then some of the human threats that we might encounter could be anything from theft to vandalism to just accidents. Things happen, so it's always good to be mindful of what could happen and how to prepare for those incidents. These are just big, broad ideas, but they're important to think about. I will say I have worked at an archival institution that did incur a water event. We never called it a flood, but we did have a water main that exploded, and the archives were under about 4 inches of water. Luckily, we had a really active disaster preparedness plan in action, and so we didn't incur any harm to our collections. But so that's just an example of, these things really do happen, and so it's important to have a plan and be prepared in case something does happen. We also, we've all been going through the pandemic, and we're learning things now that will help us going forward in the event that we experience a disaster in our institutions. Whether or not we realize it, we are definitely learning things, such as continuity of operations. If you're told one day that you are going home to telework, do you have a plan for, is someone coming up regularly to check on the physical space? Is there still trash in the trash cans that hasn't been taken out because no one's been in the building? Is someone still coming up to check on the physical space to make sure that there isn't, a leaky pipe or a roof leak? And, are the collections still secure? What kind of remote monitoring, are you doing if you're not able to physically be in the building? So I think these are a lot of things that we've all experienced over the past year and a half. And these are important lessons that we're learning and have learned, and they will help us as we move forward. So you'll want to do regular inspections of your building or your repository, I should say. Interior and exterior. You definitely want to be mindful of if there are places outside of the building where there's standing water, if you see clogged guttering, or if you see foundation damages. are there landscaping problems that could cause issues? So like, you know, are there trees growing into a window? You know, is there debris blocking a doorway where water could be pooling, something like that? Do you see evidence of pests? Do you see mold? So these are regular things that you should be routinely checking. It's helpful also if you have a building manager that can go around with you and you can point out these things together. And if you do see issues or things that you would like to mitigate or take action against, they can help you come up with a plan for how to best tackle that. So fire and water protection, these are probably the two biggest threats that we worry about in archives. You'll want to make sure that you eliminate any existing fire hazards that you might have, and also hold regular fire drills. So that could be, you know, do you have a bundle of electrical cords, you know, bundled up in the corner somewhere? Do you have fire exits that are blocked? Do you have a safe path to a fire exit? If you do have a fire, what is your plan? Do you have a plan? So these are really important things to be mindful of. And anytime you have a new staff person, it's really good to talk about these things with them to help them understand what your policies and procedures are. It's a really great idea to have smoke detectors in your collection areas, as well as fire extinguishers in your storage areas. I would recommend that you reach out to your local fire department. They can come out and do a fire inspection. And it's also helpful for them to know what the inside of your building looks like. It's helpful for them to know what areas are staff areas, what areas are collection areas, where are the exits, what does the layout look like? It'll help them to familiarize themselves with their building, and it helps you build a relationship with your local fire department in case you ever need them. For water issues, you want to make sure that you're regularly inspecting the roof, gutters, drains. It's really, really important to know where the water mains and shutoff valves are. When I experienced our water event at my previous place of employment, it was a water incursion, and nobody got to the water main as quickly as we had hoped that they would. So it's a really good idea to know where these shutoff valves are. And like I mentioned earlier, we don't want to store collections on the floor. You never know when a pipe might burst. So we really want to try to avoid those things. But bottom line, at the end of the day, your safety, the safety of your staff, the safety of any patrons that might be in your repository comes first. You always, always, always put people before collections. And then security is another good thing to think about in your disaster preparation plans. Your collection storage area, is it in a locked space? Do you have security or cameras? Do you need security or cameras? Also, when you have researchers in your repository accessing collections, do you have a researcher policy? Do you have a clear view of your researcher? Can you monitor them to make sure that they are using the materials appropriately? So these are other things to think about also. So your disaster preparedness plan, that's really your roadmap for what you need to do if a disaster occurs. You know, at minimum, it should probably include institutional information, a phone tree. Who are you going to call? Who's in charge of calling who? Contact information for emergency services and salvage priorities and procedures. So if something happens and you can't get into your building right away, when you are finally allowed into your building or into your collection storage space, what's the first collection that you're going to go check on? It's important to keep track of these things in your disaster prep plan. You might also want to include supplies, procedures, services, anything like that that could help. It should be a living document. So it should be a document that you are regularly updating, that you are regularly reading. Staff should be familiar with the document. And I think it's also helpful for it to be a physical document. I know so many of our records are digital and we're creating so much digital content that sometimes a Word document might not be easily accessible for everyone. But if you've got it printed out in a binder and it's on the shelf and it's always right there and everyone knows where it is, you can easily access that. I've also included a link down here, the NEDCC. They also have a really great preparing for a disaster plan that really gets into a lot of the specifics and nitty gritty of what your disaster preparedness plan should include and really how to get started with that. So just to kind of close up here, in summary, secure your collections. The first line of defense in protecting your collections is making sure that they are stored in archival quality materials to help slow down the deterioration process. Sometimes our storage solutions and our storage areas will never be what we want them to be, but our job is to do the best that we can with what we have. And there's a lot of things that we can do to help slow down that rate of deterioration and do really good preservation practices. And also plan for emergencies. Be cognizant of the type of emergencies that could occur in your repository, both large and small. They can happen to anyone without warning, and it's always good to have a plan. If nothing else, it will make you feel better. Speaking from personal experience, it will kind of help alleviate some of the stress that you will immediately be feeling and experiencing, to at least know that you have a plan and you know who you should talk to. So that's pretty much it for me. I did include a resource page here. Jennifer mentioned this book last week, the Charlie Arp Archival Basics book. I reviewed it for this presentation. I really, really liked it. I definitely recommend it to anyone. It is a great Archival 101 resource manual. I have also included a link to all of the NEDCC preservation leaflets. They get into some very, very specific things. If you have specific types of objects in your collection that you are curious about, specific preservation concerns, I encourage you to kind of flip through those. And then I did include links to the 3 archival suppliers that I mentioned earlier. So you can poke around on their websites and see what all they have to offer. And then just a plug here at the end. So the ARPA grants for tribal libraries, cultural centers, and museums application is officially open. You can follow this link to read about the grant opportunities that are available. And I would encourage all of you to do that and apply. The deadline to apply is Thursday, November 4th. Please feel free to reach out to myself or Jennifer or anyone at ODL. We would be more than happy to talk to you about these funding opportunities. They're really, really great, and I encourage you all to take a look at what's available. And then, I do want to mention too, so, well, I don't know if you can see it, kind of. Okay, so we will be sending you some materials paid for from ORAB with NHPRC funds. One of the things that you will be receiving is this awesome emergency response and salvage wheel. It's produced by the Foundation of the American Institute for the Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works. It's really great. One side, it has you've had a disaster, what should you do now? And then the other side is salvage how-tos for various types of objects that you might have in your collection, such as framed artworks or photographs or electronic records. So we'll be sending you some fun things in the mail. And lastly, I just want to give a plug for Jennifer's session next week on arrangement and description. She's going to tell you all about how you should organize and describe your collections. So yeah, thank you guys so much for having me today. I really appreciate it. And we can open it up for questions.
All right. That was really great. Thanks. I guess I should never be surprised that archivists' presentations tend to be so well organized. So thanks for laying all that information out. And I'm going to guess that people do have maybe their own situational questions or just other things that they want a little bit more information on while people are sort of percolating. I'll also say that we are in the process of scheduling a virtual workshop the second week of December for an introduction to digital scanning, which is something we've had a lot of requests for too. So I'll be sending out information hopefully soon for placeholders, but you all are the first ones to learn that. So you would get dibs on thinking through your December calendars. All right, you all are free to unmute yourself and ask questions, or you can write things in the chat. Or maybe it was so thorough that nobody has anything right now.
Well, if anybody, does have any questions later on or anything you think of, you can always reach out to me. Like I said, I love preservation and I love disaster prep. So, that is like my bread and butter. So I am so happy to talk about that anytime. You can always call me or send me an email and I'd love to chat about it.
I'm just going to put in a shameless plug for Holly. I attended a previous presentation she gave on the water event. And so it was really helpful because this summer we had an elevator catch fire and we had already taken some of the measures you had talked about. So it made it much easier when it came to having to deal with that in our institution. So thank you for that, Holly.
Oh, that's awesome, JJ. I'm really glad to hear that. Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about the water event. It was a flood, but water event. Of course, it happened on a holiday weekend because everything happens on a holiday weekend. And it was like Sunday morning of the holiday weekend.
And my walking break, and I'm gonna go walk.
And I had received a call from the assistant director, and he said, "Holly, you need to get up here." And I was like, "Oh, this isn't good." And so what had happened, we had a water main break. It filled up our service elevator and then proceeded to go down the hall where the archives were. So like I said, we were really, really fortunate. We had done a lot of really intensive prep work prior to that, kind of reworking our collection storage space. There were some things that we weren't storing to the best of our abilities or capabilities. So we had already done a lot of work to really make that space as best as we could. So we were really lucky that we didn't lose anything or have any damage to the materials. But when you have 4 inches of water, it crawls up the drywall. So all of the drywall had to be ripped out. And then of course we had to deal with that and cover everything in plastic sheeting, cover all of our archival shelves. So it was a lot, but I will say, having a plan definitely helps. It helps in the moment when you're really stressed out and you don't know what to do. Someone, it might not be you, but it might be someone else that says, "Hey, we've got a plan. We kind of know what we need to do." So that's really helpful in the moment to your stress is going to be really high. So that's helpful to kind of bring that stress down.
That's a really good reminder that even though you're doing hypothetical situations, it's good to know where the plan is. I really liked you saying, think about having a paper copy, because you're going to want to know sort of not only where it could be grabbed digitally if you can't get in person, but also if you can pick up a physical copy and start leafing through, that's good too. All right. Well, I think we haven't seen any questions come through, so that's a testament. Oh, wait, there's one. Do you want to read that, Holly?
Sure. Okay. So could you talk a little bit about your growth as a preservation specialist? Did you always know that preservation was your thing in archival work? Did you grow into it? This can include the certification process. So I really just grew into it as an archivist. I'm a history nerd and a science nerd. So I became very interested in the chemical processes involved with deterioration of materials. So it really kind of was something that I grew into. I was fortunate and I applied for some scholarships from the Society of Southwest Archivists, and I was able to do a couple of workshops with the Northeast Document Conservation Center, which really, kind of set me off on my preservation journey. It's just kind of by happenstance that I have this experience. I had a little bit of training prior to the water event. And then after the water event, I really, really learned a lot. So that's kind of where that comes from. If you are interested in preservation, I would definitely encourage you to look at the NEDCC and what resources, webinars, publications that they have. So I'd encourage you to do that. And then Heather says, have you had any issue with mold since the event? I don't believe so. So it's been a couple of years since I've been at that institution, but we did a really, really thorough job of ripping out the drywall. And we contracted with ServPro for that event. So they're kind of like a disaster recovery specialist company. And they came in and they like ripped out all the drywall and then they mopped all the floor with this anti-mold chemical. I can't remember exactly what it's called, but they did a lot of work to, make sure that we weren't growing mold because of all of the water. But we were really good about monitoring our temperature and humidity, making sure that we weren't having a lot of fluctuations with that. So that's another thing I would say is definitely, make sure that if you do have collections, in an area where you've had a water leak or a water issue, that you're constantly looking for mold and also monitoring your humidity and temperature, especially to make sure that you're not contributing to the problem.
I'm just going to say one other thing. I know that when those disasters happen, you can reach out to the OAA, to the SSA, to ODL. There are many organizations that have training that or can connect you with the people who have resources that can help you if you feel completely alone and lost and don't have a plan, or you're a one-stop shop and you're the only one there handling everything. Don't be afraid to ask for help in those type of situations.
Yeah, I definitely echo that. And anyone that's been through any kind of disaster event, like, you can be as prepared as you think you are, but you always learn things after the fact too. And I know that we are all really happy to help out in any way that we can. But yeah, you're not alone, and there's a lot of people that are willing to help. And so, being a part of a regional group like OAA is great because you have built-in colleagues that are here and happy to help with anything.
And Jennifer just dropped something in the chat too about disaster response team through the Oklahoma Museums Association. And I will say that the Oklahoma Museum Associations, Oklahoma Archivist Association, ORAB, all talk together and try and, build our cross connections where our membership and our key audience overlaps. So I'm glad to see that. I know that they have that regularly, disaster response. So, All right, if there are no more questions, I think at this point we will let everyone have a few minutes of their time back. And I will be sending out the slide deck from Holly, so you'll have the presentation, and the recording should go up on the OAA website sometime in the next week. So we really appreciate you all coming back and joining for this information. And don't forget, next Thursday, we're going to be doing this again. And Jennifer, why don't you say the name of, I'm going to say the
Yeah, next week on the 14th at the same time, same meeting link, we will be talking about arrangement and description.
Thank you. That's our topic for next week. All right. We'll see you all then.
See you then. Thanks.
Bye, thanks.